Welcome on behalf of the American Red Cross and our International Humanitarian Law Program. Welcome to our Space Law and Warfare webinar here in 2025. My name is Thomas Harper. I serve as Senior Counsel in International Humanitarian Law for the American Red Cross at our national headquarters here in Washington, D.C. And in sort of a bit that's relevant to this presentation, I also still serve as an Army Reserve JAG officer, so a military attorney in a reserve capacity. In that capacity, not something that's typically relevant to our webinars, our classes, but my specialty currently is space operations. So I work with the United States Army Space and Missile Defense Command, SMDC, out in Peterson Space Force Base, Colorado Springs, Colorado. And we'll have some intersection between sort of that sphere and IHL here. But we're here to talk about space. And I often get this quizzical look when I bring up the concept of space law or outer space, the concept of outer space and armed conflict. You get this like transformation in people. You may be feeling this right now. You may be thinking that you're Han Solo looking quizzically in the Star Wars universe. Like, what in the world does this have to do with IHL? This stuff is way up in orbit. This is all fantastical. This is the stuff of science fiction, the Star Wars universe, etc. In fact, many of you, this is your concept of the U.S. military's.
Sir, I need to see some
operation.
Space Force ID to let anyone inside.
Here is my Space Force ID.
That's fair. That's a fair takeaway from maybe what the American military's sort of intersection with space is, something like that Space Force show from Netflix. But in reality, the United States military, the United States as a nation has obviously deep space roots, and the genesis point, like the very start of our space exploration, our endeavors into outer space, scientific and otherwise, they always have this connection point back to the military. If you trace back the NASA's history, it is interconnected in many ways with the development of outer space for military purposes, or the exploration of space for possible military applications. If nothing else, then because of access to the defense budget. The large U.S. defense budget was a way in which NASA could further their mission. So the two have always been intrinsically connected, even though at the heart of space exploration, you're talking about a real human-oriented goal, this thing that transcends borders and political ideologies, etc. But close by is the specter of armed conflict. And certainly that took or got legs in the 1980s, certainly influenced in no small part by science fiction movies like Star Wars, Star Trek. But in many ways, as technology rapidly advanced, so too did the acceleration towards a point of possible armed conflict involving space. And as we'll see here, whether you realize it or not, space has always already played an integral part in multiple armed conflicts, including very recent armed conflicts, ones that are still happening today. So many of you that are from the sort of Gen X or before era are very familiar with Star Wars, not the movie franchise, maybe in addition to the movie franchise, but the Reagan era defense project, this push, very expensive push to try to arrange space-based defense capabilities to defend the U.S. from intercontinental ballistic missile defenses. This had legs. This wasn't just some fantastical project that gets laughed at or had a silly name. It had lots of silly names, or its sub-projects had lots of silly names. One of the most interesting is Brilliant Pebbles. I didn't make that name up. It's not created out of whole cloth. This was a legit, very expensive, heavily researched endeavor in the 1980s. Part of Star Wars. This happened toward the end of the decade there, so around 1987. And the idea behind Brilliant Pebbles was to park a constellation of satellites in orbit. When I say constellation of satellites, that should ring some 2024, 2025 bells, because that's exactly what companies like Starlink are doing, parking constellations of satellites in orbit for various purposes, communication, navigation, etc. But this project had roots in a warfare defensive or national defense type capability. And the idea was you park this constellation of satellites in low Earth orbit. We'll go over what exactly LEO is momentarily, so don't worry if you're not familiar with the terminology. But these satellites would be equipped with missiles or some form of, as we call it, kinetic effect, so the ability to destroy something else. The idea was that some of these satellites would always, or some portion of this constellation would always be orbiting, at that point, the USSR, the Soviet Union. And they would be able to detect any sort of intercontinental ballistic missile, ICBM type launch, the launch of a nuclear missile. At that point, this constellation or the relevant portion would move in and would release its missiles and destroy the ICBM threat, saving the United States. So this was called Brilliant Pebbles. I don't know who named it, but I hope that they're continually toasted every year. And if that sounds fantastical, it's not, because not only was it real then, it is the genesis point. The ideas behind Brilliant Pebbles are being explored right now in 2025 as the basis for current modern day advanced ICBM or other missile defense technology. In 2025, at the beginning of this year, as administrations changed out here in the United States, you had the announcement of the Iron Dome for America, otherwise known as the Golden Dome. This project is based or has its roots in the tech or the ideas behind Brilliant Pebbles. So lest you think this was just a silly thing that had a silly name and expired back in the 80s, it is back in sort of front page news. It is getting funding. This is the here and now. Everything old is new again. I mentioned that space has been relevant in conflicts that are ongoing right now. And the main conflict that I'm referencing is the war between Ukraine and Russia, which kicked off in its current phase with the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February of 2022. And you might be thinking, well, Thomas, this is a land war. This is a war between two powers, neither of whom have employed space assets. Ukraine doesn't have any space assets, right? This is a very traditional war. Well, space played a huge role in February 2022 and in the months prior, because it helped Russia launch its successful invasion. Leading into February of 2022, the vast majority of Ukrainian satellite infrastructure, internet infrastructure, in other words, the government and Ukrainian civilian access to the internet, was predominantly done through this satellite-based internet company called Viasat. The vast majority of Ukrainian government contracts for satellite internet access was through Viasat. Russia understood this. They knew that this was an exploitable point. And so without launching any missiles from space, there's no ICBMs flying around or anything like that, but Russia recognized this dependency on a satellite-based element of communication, the internet being key for things like navigation, communication, all of these things that are really critical for maybe helping an invasion along or helping a country defend itself against an invasion. So Russia launched a large-scale malware attack, the Russian military did, known as Acid Rain. It infected these uplink downlinks, so the communication nodes between Ukrainian government and military forces and the satellites that provided them with the internet, including in far-flung areas, maybe outside the range of the sort of wire-based internet we're used to here, fiber optics and that sort of thing that form the backbone of internet in metropolitan areas. And it caused absolute chaos. I mean, the scale of this attack and the profound effect that it had on the Ukrainian government and the Ukrainian military just can't be understated. You look at quotes from around that time discussing the attack, discussing the impact that it had on Ukrainian communications, its ability to use the internet to communicate with the outside world, much less its own forces. And it is described as no less than a catastrophe. I mean, it really was a form of a miracle that the Ukrainian military was able to navigate around this challenge and mount an effective response against those early days of the invasion. So here you have space playing a really critical role in a very traditional conflict without anything ever entering or exiting orbit. I mean, none of those Viasat satellites were destroyed. There's no missiles flying around in space, no ICBMs being launched. And yet, space was this critical hinge point in this conflict that could have easily spelled the complete and total defeat of Ukraine within a month of the conflict. Think about that for a modern military. Think about that in the context of the United States military, and take away any actual space-based technology or abilities. Take away all this fantastical Star Wars type stuff, and just think about the normal operation of a military or the U.S. military. Think about this logistics convoy. These are fuel trucks here from the U.S. military. Think about the dependency with which this convoy of fuel trucks needs to get from point A, a fueling point, to point B, troops or equipment that are in need of the fuel that they carry, or perhaps a forward base that's in critical need of the fuel in these trucks to continue their operations. Just the basic business of navigating from point A to point B. Obviously, the military is going to be trained to use basic non-space-based navigational methods, break out that old compass, determine your azimuth and go. You use your traditional mounted land navigation technology, but the starting point is not that old trusty compass in your pocket. The starting point is GPS. We'll talk about GPS a little bit more momentarily, but just that one singular technology is reliant on space-based capabilities, that network of satellites orbiting Earth. And if you were to disrupt that capability, if you were to disrupt US GPS satellites, those 30 or so satellites in orbit, think about the risk that you could put this single convoy. Think about the risk that plays to the end recipients of that fuel, that base, those troops, those vehicles, whatever the case may be. Now extrapolate that. Think about this as an army or a military that's playing a rapid defense or executing a rapid offensive military operation, and suddenly you take away their central and primary point of navigating, of communicating, of making sure that one truck can talk to another, that these trucks in total in this convoy can talk back to headquarters. Again, we're not talking any fantastical space-based capabilities here. Again, no missiles, no lasers from space, no exo-atmospheric kill vehicles or anything like that. We're talking just basic ones and zeros that let you get from point A to point B and talk uninterrupted from one point to another. And think about the damage that can cause if it's disrupted. Again, space-based technology, not sexy, not flashy, but ones that remain absolutely critical to any military's operations. Now, the current sort of space race, as it were, is really between two countries. It's between the US and China, to a lesser extent, Russia. We like to think about Russia as this major space power, and it still retains significant launch capabilities, significant space-based capabilities. But really, when you look at just the cadence of activity, here we have orbital launch attempts in 2024, last year represented. You see that there is really no comparison. You've got the US and China way out ahead, Russia in a distant third, and fourth place and beyond is even further behind than even that. So when you talk about this sort of military space race, really at the center of that are these two countries, China and the United States, and both have sort of more cutting edge components of their military that are focused on the space-based fight. In the case of the United States, it's Space Force. Although as a space judge advocate here in the United States Army, I would tell you that all components of the United States military touch space. The Space Force has one sort of side of the portfolio, or one element of the portfolio, albeit a very important one. Over in China, you have the PLA Aerospace Force, again, very similar in terms of the scope and direction of their operations to the U.S. Space Force, even though the two components of the respective militaries are different in other critical ways. It's not just these first world countries, the United States, these superpowers that are touching space either. In 2023, we had a space-based incident between Houthi fighters in Yemen. So I don't know what your concept of Houthi fighters was. I think for most people, you probably envision low-tech insurgent forces. Maybe they have some drones or some maybe a little more advanced equipment from countries like Iran or others that are arming them. But you wouldn't think of the Houthis as being equipped with weaponry that can touch space, or that effectively qualifies as space-based or space weaponry. And yet in 2023, so nearly 3 years ago at this point, you had the Houthis leading what ended up being a space type of attack. They launched a Ghadar 110 missile. This missile was intercepted by the Israelis, and that intercept point happened in space. It happened at that 100-mile mark above Earth. We'll get into sort of what is the definition of entry into outer space, but this is a space-based conflict, right? This is a use of kinetic force, a destructive force between two militaries that happened in outer space. And yet it's not between the United States and China, or US and Russia. It is between Houthi militants and Israel. So I think if you leave here with one thing, it's to be disabused with the premise or the assumption that a fight in space, or a fight with space-based or ground-based technology that has effects on space, or vice versa, is limited to a handful of countries, because that's simply not the case at all. As 2025 moves into 2026, the sort of global powers, the US, China, Russia, are continuing to invest tremendous amounts of money, technology, cooperation into space-based technologies, or the ability to effectuate military aims from space. And so before we get into the legal ins and outs of it, it makes sense to lay down or discuss the basics of the space area of operations, or AO, as we like to say for short in the military, because the terminology, where things happen, the geometrics of things, the physics of things, are all these unique components that don't necessarily factor in the same ways to land-based fights. So this first bubble around Earth, bubble as it were, this being an imaginary sphere around Earth, is what you call LEO, or low Earth orbit. This is between 100 to 1,200 miles above Earth. LEO is the most crowded point of any level of orbit in terms of satellite traffic. Right now, as we sit here, there's something on the order of 12,000 satellites orbiting in low Earth orbit. That number has probably changed since I pulled that figure. It's probably 12,500, 13,000. It is changing by the hour, by the day, as more and more launches go up. Low Earth orbit is the place where a lot of these familiar players like Starlink are active. These constellations of satellites, as I mentioned before in the context of Brilliant Pebbles, something like a Starlink uh, uh, constellation of satellites, that 7,000 strong constellation of satellites in the case of that company, is operating in low Earth orbit, in LEO for short. This is a very congested area. This is also where something like the International Space Station sits. And although I say it's very congested, I don't want you to think that LEO is this area where, like, every second things are passing each other within a hair's breadth. It's a very crowded space, but it's not quite that crowded. We'll get into some of the possibilities about destructive effects within LEO and the second and third order effects as well. But beyond LEO, we get into a second sort of sphere beyond that, and this is the 1,200 to 22,000 mile sort of elevation, and this is MEO, medium Earth orbit. In MEO, sort of the most famous of satellites here would be your GPS, Global Positioning System satellites. That's that 30 satellite constellation run by the US government. China, Russia, and the EU all have their own navigation-centric constellations here. The EU's is Galileo, GLONASS is Russia's, etc. So you have those sitting in middle Earth orbit. And then out beyond that, you have geo orbit, geostationary orbit. This is way above Earth. It takes a lot of resources to get into geo orbit. You're talking 22,000 plus miles above Earth. That's, like, quite honestly difficult to wrap your brain around. But it takes a tremendous amount of resources to get up to this point because of the height. It's a really advanced level of technology to reach GEO compared to reaching a LEO orbit. And this is where your big billion-dollar satellites are orbiting. Out beyond that, you have something called the graveyard orbit. So this is where, like, a lot of ash and trash sits. So satellites that run out of fuel or live beyond their usefulness, they're sort of navigated out into this sphere beyond GEO orbit, and they sit in what's called graveyard orbit, not depicted here. It's important to note that one point that I would say here, it's called geostationary orbit because as you view an item, a satellite that's in geo orbit, it's going to appear to remain in the same spot. So it's sort of locked with Earth's rotation in that same spot, hence the stationary portion of geostationary. Understand that in all of these orbits, what you're not talking about are items that are flying around with, like, rocket boosters that are jetting themselves around. Really what you're talking about, I won't get into the physics too deeply here, but understand that at any point at any one of these orbits, what you're really talking about is objects that are moving at a speed necessary to defeat gravity. So it's that equilibrium that they're finding between speed and the gravitational pull of the Earth. And so it's not that something is just floating out in space untethered. It's that they've found that equilibrium point. And when you think about a satellite launched from Earth, we think about a rocket going upwards. As I always thought about it as a kid, the rocket just goes straight up. The engine burns until it hits orbit, and then it just sort of floats around. When in reality, that sort of vertical motion, that vertical boost phase is a pretty small portion of the journey to get into orbit. At a certain point, sooner than you might think, the rocket, whatever is carrying the satellite or the payload, it starts to turn with the Earth. And then the business of the energy being expended from boosters or whatever is trying to get it fast enough to hit that equilibrium point. So it's this weird scenario in which we often think or maybe get taught that these objects are just sort of floating around. In reality, they're just sort of in this constant state of falling. It's a bizarre thing to think about. You watch an astronaut go on a spacewalk from the ISS, and you're like, well, they're technically falling if we're being true to physics. They're just at a rate where they're not going to fall into Earth's gravitational pull because they are moving sort of constantly around at a speed sufficient to defeat that point. And so you're talking just something like 30,000 kilometers an hour or so speed to get around and defeat that gravitational pull. Like really mind-blowing numbers. Like your Ford Mustang's not going to reach that speed, obviously, but that obviously complicates things. That's going to become a key point when we start to talk about conflict in space, because these objects aren't stationary. They're moving at high rates of speed. That clip that we saw from House of Dynamite really illustrates, without getting into the details or science of it, the difficulty with which it is to try to target and do basic military operations with space-based targets involved. So I mentioned GPS, and understand that this is sort of a foundational space-based technology. That 30 constellation satellite, 3 of those satellites are always, in theory, going to be able to be in view. So if you get 3, you can get relatively accurate positional data. If you can get a 4th satellite in view from that constellation, you can also be provided with elevation. And this is precise direction. The reason that this is so relied upon is because of its precision. Even though these are satellites floating in middle Earth orbit, the precision with which they can help you navigate or find your point on the map, we're talking the provision of a grid coordinate, to go back to like old school map reading, those digits on a map that tell you where you are positionally, but that can get you within 10 meters, 30 feet of a location. You can use GPS. I mean, you could certainly use a map and a compass and whatnot to try to determine a point with that type of precision, but that's slow. It can be inaccurate. It's subject to human error, that sort of thing. GPS can give you this information instantaneously and provide you, in certain circumstances, with that elevational data as well. You talk about a really helpful tool in the hands of a military. GPS is absolutely foundational. It's important to note, in the scope of thinking about the space area of operations, where does space actually begin? Because that starts to influence our analysis of the law. If we're talking about application of a treaty that deals with outer space, well, it stands to reason that the application of a treaty like that would apply to outer space. So where does outer space begin? Where is the legal definition for that? The short answer, thanks, this is like lawyers' gift to society here, or outer space lawyers' gift to society here. There is no legal definition. There is no settled upon definition of where outer space begins. Depending on what you're looking at, or whether it's scientific material or a legal interpretation, you're going to get a different answer. There is no legal definition for it. One that you'll see tossed around a lot is the von Karman line. So this is about 100 kilometers, 62 miles above the Earth's surface. This is typically regarded as the transition into outer space. Although in the treaties that we'll talk about, the Outer Space Treaty chief among them, this isn't referenced as the point at which, or the legal point at which, space begins. There is no international consensus on this fact. And depending on the scenario, depending on the question and the application of law, what is allowed, what isn't allowed under the law, I think that's a scenario where you could easily see these disagreements come to fruition. One country saying, hey, you violated this treaty. You can't be doing X, Y, or Z with your military. It violates international law because you can't do this activity in space. The natural response to that is, where are you considering outer space? We're not operating in outer space. Well, you're above the von Karman line. You're in outer space. Well, no, that says who? Like we're above that notional distance, but where in the law does that say that that's outer space? In our view, we're below outer space. We would never violate this treaty or this law. That's why we're operating below the point of outer space. So you see pretty quickly, that's a scenario that's detached from any like specific facts or whatever, but you can easily see the tension point that can exist with the absence of a consensus definition of a critical element like this. Where does it begin? We think about the law all the time as a question of jurisdiction. Jurisdiction being, where does the law apply? Where does the clause of this particular statute get its hooks in? And jurisdiction is entirely appropriate when it comes to questions of space law. And unfortunately, we don't have a clear measure there. I mentioned the number of satellites in LEO. There's obviously less in MEO and GEO. But nonetheless, this is a crowded battle space. When you start to regard outer space as a potential venue for armed conflict, and I say potential, in reality, it is a venue for armed conflict. A space-based armed conflict doesn't have to involve lasers being shot between starfighters in outer space. It can and has and will continue to involve effects from satellites onto the battle space on Earth and vice versa, ground station or ground effects onto satellites or other objects in orbit. And so it bears emphasis that this is a really crowded battle space that complicates all these procedures. When space exploration first started, something as simple as reconnaissance was really rudimentary when it came to space. You would get these vehicles that would go up into space or maybe touch orbit. They would take their pictures and then they would send these capsules back to Earth. They would eject their film canisters. Yes, they used actual film back in the day on these things. For our Gen Alpha folks on the webinar, we'll have to have a separate class on what film is. But in any event, it was crazy. You'd have to have aircraft go out and retrieve these canisters, these top secret images that were taken. And that was sort of how you did business back then for just the simple act of reconnaissance. That has now become vastly more complicated. Look at the just absolute climb in this graph that merely plots satellites in orbit. From 1960 until really the year 2000, it's not demarcated there, but 2010, you don't have a massive amount of growth in the number of satellites in orbit. But you fast forward to 2014 to 2016, 2017, as we enter the era of commercial space exploration, commercial launch capabilities from companies like SpaceX, Blue Origin, et cetera, commercial satellite constellations, these things that go beyond government operated satellites like the GPS constellation. And you see this absolute untethered climb in the number of satellites in orbit. We'll talk about the UN registration convention in just a moment as part of the current laydown of space law. But if you go down and look at registrations of launches of objects in space, of satellites, keep in mind, we'll discuss this, but keep in mind that registration is not 100%. It's all voluntary, so it doesn't capture every single launch or object in space. If you snapshotted a window between 2000 and just hit print on a set of registrations between the year 2000 and 2025, 90 to 95% of the paper that you print with those registrations is going to happen within the last 5 to 7 years. It is astronomical, the climb in satellites in orbit. And these satellites are performing all variety of function. The days of dropping your film canister back to Earth and you get this one and done reconnaissance mission, those are long gone. Now you have not just a crowded battle space in terms of the pure number of satellites in orbit, but you have satellites and these orbital objects that are performing multiple tasks. Think about the cost to get an object into orbit. It's very, very high, even if you're talking, a critical component for a company or the government. And so oftentimes you're seeing dual use objects go up into space. This is something that's happened for NASA's entire existence. I mentioned, making use of the defense budget to further NASA's civilian aims of human space exploration. Well, oftentimes in practice, what that looked like is a satellite that would go up. It could have weather gathering or weather analyzing capabilities in one part, and perhaps some reconnaissance capabilities that were military centric elsewhere. In practical terms, that's a cost sharing endeavor. We really would like to get this weather technology up and operable. The way to do that, the feasible way to do it, is to partner with the military. You continue to see that. It's just at a much larger scale now. And so that low Earth orbit continues to get more and more crowded. Just yesterday, so we're recording this in December of 2025. Just yesterday or the day before, it came out that a group of scientists who keep sort of a close eye on the risk of a catastrophic chain collision in low Earth orbit that could trigger something called the Kessler syndrome. So this catastrophic chain link in which one collision in orbit leads to another and another and another and another. And so you get this cloud of space debris that makes it impossible for any human to reach space anymore. Not something that would happen overnight, but the time between, say, losing control of a satellite or losing communication with a satellite, that can happen, and not just because of military application, a jamming effect or something like that. It could happen. It's happened as recently as, I think, 2024 was the last big solar storm that we had. A scientific phenomenon happens, a solar storm happens, and it degrades or disables communication with satellites. Well, suddenly, the more crowded you get in LEO, which is where the vast majority of our satellites are, the higher the risk of collision in that chain linking effect happens. And so this article, this alarm that was put out by these scientists, is that we're closer than we ever have been before to a point of triggering this irreversible chain link. Because understand, when an object is hit in space, it's not like Earth where, a few fragments just fly everywhere and maybe settle. Those fragments are in orbit. Some may re-enter Earth's atmosphere, but the vast majority will stay. We're talking potentially thousands upon thousands of fragments will stay in orbit. These things that are flying at thousands upon thousands of kilometers an hour. You can imagine that as one piece of debris causes another piece of destruction or collision, that creates its own debris. You have the Kessler syndrome, sort of in a nutshell. Understood. It doesn't happen in a day. It doesn't happen overnight. But as we get more and more crowded, this threat is going to become even greater, and that has real implications on military interactions. Use of force against the satellite, disabling a satellite, jamming a satellite, removing control of a country or an entity from its satellite or its entire constellation of satellites. Imagine if Starlink tomorrow was shut out of communication with its 7,000 satellites in orbit. It wouldn't take a terribly long time for something to go seriously wrong if they lost that control for an extended period. And I don't mean months, I mean days. 72 hours, say, loss of control of that many satellites, and bad things could happen. That can certainly happen because of non-man-made, just scientific phenomenon. It can absolutely happen in the case of an armed conflict. Along with that, the business of espionage, imagery, taking stock of what's on Earth. Another critical component of those satellites in orbit, many of which are in LEO, is this business of launch detection. So determining when and where something has been launched. Typically, we're talking ICBMs, but as you saw with that Yemen example and the Houthis, an ICBM doesn't necessarily mean an advanced missile that only a few countries have. It can be a missile that's capable of touching orbit with conventional explosives aboard. But the ability to detect those launches, to determine where they're from, is absolutely critical to a military. It's as critical in a conflict scenario. Hey, we've got to defend ourselves. Think about the House of Dynamite clip. We need to take action and launch countermeasures against this missile to defend ourselves. That's just as important as it is to determine that something is not a hostile launch or is not a threat. Hey, we've detected this launch. Okay, well, the space-based capability has allowed us to determine that this is from a friendly country, or that this is a non-military launch, or that this is a test launch that has splashed down somewhere in the ocean harmlessly. Launch detection is absolutely critical at all stages, from the business of de-escalating potential conflict to actual conflict itself. And I lump that right in with the business of navigation, of intelligence collection that we've already discussed. So I've purposefully taken some time to set the scene for the foundation of space law, because it's important to understand those sort of roots, where the fact that conflict has already and will continue to involve space-based capabilities or ground abilities that can have effects on space, and the fact that it is a multi-dimension, multifaceted area of operations that goes beyond just a single satellite spinning around the Earth. So let's talk about the legal foundations. And to do that, I want to roll us back to 1967. So this is really the height of the space race. Human space exploration has been going on for more than a decade at this point, but there was no real robust, formal international legal framework around outer space and the conduct of nations in space. Space exploration had been happening since the early 50s. You go back to the USSR's Sputnik launch and whatnot. You're talking about a decade plus without an international treaty in place, while technology rapidly advances and major powers in the world are developing the technology, yes, certainly to further scientific exploration in the interest of humanity, obviously. But the USSR, US, et cetera, were also in this race for military purposes as well. They desperately did not want to be beaten by their adversary in that race because of the implications that it would have on national defense, the ability to spy on each other, the ability to potentially launch missiles. At that point, the advancement of nuclear weapons had gone far beyond the end of World War II. You're looking at the advancement of the ability to put a nuclear warhead onto a missile to reach destinations previously unheard of in terms of distance of launch. And so the OST comes at a really, really critical time. It's quite frankly amazing that we went as a sort of human society so long without something like this. But the OST comes into place, and if you crack it open, it's both fairly robust and not robust at all at the same time. It's weird. It's a weird juxtaposition that it lives in. It's robust in that it, for the first time, attempts or is the international community's attempt to wrap its arms around human space exploration, what those implications are, what the world has already seen, and what we might see. So the drafters of this treaty were forced in a very unique way to look forward into time, to guess what potential uses, what potential intent there might be of countries operating in outer space. And so they're in an untenable position, an unenviable position of having to account for what's come very rapidly over the last decade plus, but also act as sort of Nostradamus and predict what might be and craft a law that wouldn't become irrelevant or obsolete as fast as the technology was developing. So the OST sets the stage. You then have a series of treaties that I would say are more focused in their efforts. A year later, you have the Rescue and Return Agreement, the RRA, which concerns the business of countries' obligations to astronauts. What happens when an astronaut is in distress? How are astronauts regarded? In many cases, take the United States. Many of our NASA astronauts, including some to this day, are military officers. Many of NASA's original pilots, engineers, they all came from the ranks of the United States military. The same was true for cosmonauts. And so there's a world in which you could look at individuals like that and say, well, those are combatants. They wear a military uniform. I get that they've slapped a NASA flag or a patch on their arm, but those are combatants at their core, and that could lead to a very different outcome depending on the circumstance. But here you have the RRA come into play, and it establishes sort of astronauts as envoys to humanity and lays down a set of obligations to rescue and ultimately return them to their country of origin following a rescue. Fast forward into the early 1970s, and you have what's known as the Liability Convention. The Liability Convention concerns not necessarily armed conflict. It's not armed conflict really centric. I would argue armed conflict really wasn't the genesis point for this treaty, but it concerns what happens when something goes wrong and stuff on the ground is damaged. Who is responsible when debris from space crashes back down to Earth and causes damage? And unsurprisingly, the Liability Convention has been triggered in certain circumstances since its inception. I mentioned the UN Registration Convention. So the idea behind the Registration Convention in 1975 was we want to encourage, say encourage because it's voluntary, compliance is voluntary. We want to encourage states and non-state entities, commercial entities, to come on record with what they are putting into space, with launches, with items that are sitting in orbit. And to this day, you can go Google right now the UN Registration Convention. There is a public registry, a database, as I mentioned before, of these launches, of these objects. What you'll see is that borne out in that registration, in that data that you can pull, is a couple Achilles heels of the Registration Convention. The drafters understood that they were walking a fine line. Oftentimes, the objects that are put into space contain secrets. They contain top secret technology, information, secrets regarding the intent. Why are we putting this into space? What is our purpose in using this? Are we shielding something secret on something else? What's the launch vehicle? Who's doing that? The military versus civilians, etc. They recognized that with all that backdrop, they could craft a treaty that no one would follow at all. That if you tried to turn the screws too tightly, that the result would be a treaty that just either wouldn't be enforceable at all, or that no one would agree to sign on to. So the drafters attempted to find a middle point where you have the Registration Convention with no teeth to it. So there is no punishment mechanism. There's no enforcement mechanism to require a country to register objects or launches. There's no punishment if you don't. And what they're trying to do is encourage voluntary compliance. So Achilles heel one is that even though it looks like there's a lot of stuff on that registry, it's a partial list. Just understand that for every launch that's on there, there are a number that are not slipping through the cracks, but that just aren't on there. for one reason or another. It could be a decision made by a company. It could be a decision made by a state, etc. The other Achilles heel is the description of what the purpose of that satellite or that object is. And what you'll find is when you look at that category, it's really generic. You could just, in some ways, it doesn't tell you anything at all when you look at something because the categories of registration are so broad. It's something like communication. Okay, thank you. That tells me a lot, but also nothing at all at once. The drafters recognize that if you try to hem in states too much, force them to divulge too much in the way of information about the purpose behind a satellite, well, they're just not going to sign on. They're not going to comply. They're not going to agree to this. And the whole thing just becomes irrelevant before the ink is even dried on the treaty signatures. So you'll see that second Achilles heel being the very generic description of what these objects are for. For some, you can look at something like a Starlink launch and see communication satellite, say, okay, that makes sense. Others, it can be helpful if you've heard of a company or you see a company that's listed on there. Maybe it's a new company. You're not quite sure what it is they're doing. Maybe you hear that they've gotten into the business of space launches or whatever. Maybe that gives you some helpful information about it. For a state, it's of limited utility, I would argue, but it is just one of those realities that goes along with trying to implement a treaty for perfectly understandable, laudable purposes, but having to balance against the reality that state governments operate in. Up to this point in history, so up to 1984, you have sort of large compliance with treaties, large support of the treaties up to this point. The Moon Agreement is where this changes. The Moon Agreement attempts to refine and narrow in some of the definitions from the Outer Space Treaty, and in particular, ratchet down on what's allowed in terms of military conduct in outer space. As a result, the Moon Agreement, when you compare it to the OST, has far, far fewer signatories to it. The Moon Agreement has, I think certainly less than 50, but none of the major spacefaring powers, the US, Russia, China, none have ratified in full the Moon Agreement. And in no small part, that's because of the disagreements or the concerns with how the agreement purports to narrow in or dial in some of these definitions. States enjoy the maneuverability that broad definitions give them, broad swaths of interpretation. So the OST is good in that regard. And we'll look at how that looks in practice in just a second, because we're going to go back to the OST and look at its application to military uses. So the OST lays down this fundamental principle that space shall be used exclusively for peaceful purposes. That's in no uncertain terms. And so if you're a country that thinks no military activity should be allowed in outer space, I'm trying something new with these clips. You think, okay, well, that provision, that statement is in no uncertain terms, and it makes it pretty clear. You can't be, abusing outer space for military purposes. The business of putting weapons in space or creating weaponry with that's designed to either have space to space-based effects or space to ground-based effects. All that's clearly prohibited, right? We don't need to go any further than the OST. Those drafters were great, right? Well, what about the U.S.?
You sure about that? You sure about that?
So a country like the U.S., and this is not shade on the United States, but this goes back to just treaty interpretation and the affinity that many countries have to large avenues of approach when it comes to legal analysis, is that the U.S., many countries look at that provision, they say, well, the OST only prohibits some military activities in space. There's not an outright ban on military activities in space. Otherwise, I would argue the US wouldn't have signed on in the first place, wouldn't have ratified the OST. And specifically, the OST prohibits a few things. And the specificity of the OST with these few things means that the drafters were smart and careful enough to delineate and identify these few things that are specifically prohibited. They could have, by extension, mentioned all sorts of things that are prohibited, but they didn't. They had that power. They used that power to draft these specific prohibitions. The fact that they didn't extend that specific list beyond that means that not all military activities in space are prohibited. That specific list includes no military bases on moon or celestial bodies. I think you can drive a truck through that term military bases, and the U.S. would certainly make that argument about what that is or what that could be, what that includes. There can be no testing of weapons or military maneuvers on the moon or celestial bodies. Notice what that doesn't include: orbit, right? So right there, you have a difference in specificity. The OST talks in terms of stuff on the moon. So we don't have a military base on the moon right now. We've got a flag, a nice cultural site with the Apollo moon landing, but we don't have a fort that, no doubt, with my luck in being stationed in certain places in the Army, I would get stationed on the moon if something like that were allowed. But it's not under the OST. But notice, just in these two, you're already seeing the difference in the maneuver room and legal analysis. And then lastly, no nuclear weapons in space. Now, this one arguably is a little bit clearer, but think about that clip that I showed from House of Dynamite. That movie is about a nuclear ICBM and the U.S. attempt to defeat that ICBM in space. So that clip showcases that EKV that's mentioned in the clip, where they're watching the thing get graphed on the computer screen, and everybody has this like shocking moment when it's a miss. That is that missile that's launched in the beginning of the clip, that ground-based interceptor out of Fort Greely, Alaska, being launched up. It carries what's called an exo-atmospheric kill vehicle, an EKV. That EKV's job is to intercept a missile that is transiting through space on its way back into Earth. Now, a literal reading of that would be like, that's a nuke in space. That nuke is in space when you are trying to launch and destroy it with an EKV. Yet that's not how the OST has been interpreted. This ban on nukes in space in the OST has been interpreted to mean like parking a nuclear weapon in space. So say a space-based launch capability, so a satellite that has or some celestial object that has the ability to launch a nuclear weapon, not something that's transiting through orbit. We're getting really technical here. This is why people absolutely love attorneys. It's for these kind of gradients and analysis, where we take something that's seemingly clear and we make it just about as knotted as you could possibly be. But this is the gradients that stem from the OST and countries trying to find a way to sort of maneuver around and do what they want to do. So I mentioned that specificity and the lack thereof. So that's your specificity up on the top, those three provisions. And the takeaway here from countries like the United States is that any other non-aggressive military activities don't violate the OST. Now, non-aggressive, you can look at that certainly in a really restrictive way. You could say, hey, any military presence, any military activity is by definition aggressive, because it raises the specter of the use of force. But that's not how it's interpreted. It's interpreted much more broadly. So the business of military testing, non-offensive military capabilities, even passive intelligence collecting, all of those things are not seen as aggressive military activities. And I would include the use of GPS in there as well. Again, an active use of a satellite system for military activities on the ground, but it doesn't violate the OST. What you have here is this interesting interplay of other boundaries that constrain or rein in or influence state conduct, or now commercial conduct in space. The business of geopolitics, national policy, national and operational security, rules of engagement, or the authorities to use certain technologies that you have. All of these interplay. It wasn't too long ago that you saw a back and forth between Russia and the United States at the UN, arguing over the purported positioning or stationing of nuclear weapons by Russia, or the attempts to station nuclear weapons by Russia in outer space. And this plays out in public at the UN Security Council, UN General Assembly as well. And it is geopolitical maneuvering, the finger wagging between states in an attempt to elicit compliance with the OST or highlight non-compliance in one state or the other's view of the OST. This isn't a lawsuit to try to restrain conduct. It's not a plea to the International Court of Justice, the ICJ, or some other like punitive measure. This is politicking, right? But the design behind that by both countries is to try to maneuver around and use geopolitics overlaid on national policy, overlaid on national and operational security concerns, to try to influence the conduct of one another. So this stuff is playing out all the time. The calculation of a country like Russia to use or launch a malware attack on space-based capabilities, that is cross-cutting across all of these things. These things are playing out in the public eye, but also often behind the public eye as well. I just use those public examples to illustrate the fact that you don't have to look far back in history to find examples of this overlay. And so it's not just
done things which nobody's ever done before.
Yeah, but your scientists were so preoccupied with whether or not they could, they didn't stop to think if they should.
So I highlight this Jurassic Park clip. Your scientists were so preoccupied with whether they could, they didn't stop to think whether they should. That has some key application here. Whether the OST or whether space law by definition allows certain conduct is oftentimes secondary to the question of whether a state or a commercial entity should do something. The answer to the latter, whether they should do something, is often influenced by all of those non-legal sources that I mentioned: the geopolitics, national security policy, etc. And so that should is almost, if not more powerful than the must that the law introduces. So understand that just like here on Earth, outer space law and its application to military activities is always going to have this tension point between what the law says, what the law requires or outlaws or specifically authorizes, and a country's decision points that sit in perhaps a gray area or an area where it's technically allowed, but otherwise it's influenced for good or bad by other purposes. Rules of engagement are a great example of that. No rule of engagement can ever authorize a military to violate IHL. You can't establish an ROE that clears soldiers to break the law. But you can shape ROE to tell soldiers that they have to conduct themselves in ways that the law doesn't speak to. Hey, we're not going to use helicopters in this area of operations. That is outlawed under the ROE. Well, IHL doesn't have anything to say about that, about helicopters specifically, or where they should or shouldn't fly. But an ROE can, and it's influenced by that should question. That same application exists with outer space law and the business of employing certain capabilities as well. So credit to Dr. Malcolm for that one. We're going to wrap up here, and I realize I'm beyond the hour, so thanks for sticking along if you could, but with application or the overlay of space law to conflict. Understand that all of those treaties that I just mentioned, the OST, the Rescue Return Agreement, Liability Convention, none of that is IHL. None of it is IHL. None of it is international humanitarian law. Yet the two spheres are connected. On one hand, you have space law. On the other, you have the law of armed conflict or international humanitarian law. So that body of law applicable to the conduct of armed conflict. What they share is that LOAC applies to space conflicts. Understand that. If you look in the Geneva Conventions and their triggering point, so what is an armed conflict, they apply, IHL as a body of law applies to armed conflicts wherever they occur in whatever capacity they occur in. So the drafters of IHL were smart enough to recognize that they couldn't predict how wars would be fought, in what venues war would be fought in at all points in the history beyond their time. What they did was give IHL a general applicability that allowed it to be maneuverable and applicable to futuristic conflicts, to include space-based conflicts. So space law, as this body of law that developed as human space exploration exploded, and LOAC and IHL, a body of law that developed as humans continued to fight each other, they're both what's known as lex specialis. So these are specialized areas of the law, in this case, international law. And lex specialis is important because as a concept, this Latin term, I picked the wrong field of law to go into because it's rife with Latin and French, and I'm from North Carolina, and none of that meshes with my upbringing. So lex specialis is really critical because when you have a specialized area of the law, space law, IHL, LOAC, it is going to take precedence over more general areas of the law or general laws when it comes to the domain that that law is applicable in. So when it comes to space law, something like the OST as a lex specialis is going to trump maybe domestic laws or other international laws, which are maybe more generally applicable, but haven't been tailored specifically for space. Likewise, IHL does the same thing in the context of armed conflicts. There are all sorts of international laws, take international human rights law as just one example, that are operable. They don't just stop. They don't go away because you're in an armed conflict. But IHL takes the driver's seat, just like space law takes the driver's seat when you're talking about the space domain. So both are lex specialis, and there's sort of a dual lex specialis triggering point here, or a stacking effect here, because you have the speciality of outer space as a particular venue. So space law is a lex specialis for outer space. When you talk about conflict in outer space, well, now you're sprinkling on some specificity onto that. Now you stack IHL or LOAC on top of that. So the two work in complementary fashion. LOAC and IHL will work with space law. It's not as if the OST or the Rescue and Return Agreement just evaporate when conflict breaks out in space. But IHL will have precedence. But the two work in concert with each other. If there are contradictions, and this is where lex specialis comes into particular play, if there are contradictions, then IHL is going to take priority, or the applicable portion of IHL will take priority when it comes to analysis. So in IHL, we have these core fundamental principles. I've illustrated 3 of them here: distinction, proportionality, and necessity. These are unique or these concepts, these principles are unique to the conduct of armed conflict. The OST doesn't mention any of them. But when it comes to the business of, say, GPS, right? The OST doesn't say anything about the ability to target the GPS constellation, to destroy it, to jam it, to spoof, dazzle it, whatever. And so IHL is going to come into play if we're talking about an armed conflict. And so long as you're complying with IHL, and these 3 fundamental principles are at the core of that analysis, well, that specialty law, IHL, is going to be the front seat. So you're going to need to comply with this. You'll have to, take stock of space law, see if there's an applicable portion of outer space law that has a conflict with IHL. And if there's a conflict, then you resolve it in favor of IHL. Here in this example, there is no conflict because outer space law, the OST, and all those other treaties that I mentioned, they don't talk about the destructive capabilities. They don't talk about the application of military force in an armed conflict in space. And so IHL applies in this scenario. So I'll briefly talk and contextualize this with the U.S. Army's role. So this is sort of what I'm most familiar with. If you didn't know this, the Army does have a space badge. You can qualify not just as an Army astronaut, which there are several right now serving, but you can be a space soldier and get a badge for it. It's kind of cool. The Army regards this as a multi-domain fight, and this is the entire U.S. military. So the military does not view an armed conflict on a two-dimensional plane. They view it three-dimensional. That seems like, well, duh, Thomas, like no kidding. But space plays a critical role here because in the same vein that you look at the battle space in a three-dimensional context with regard to air support, support from your sea-based assets, tactical support, you have those same components, those same capabilities coming from outer space when it comes to communications, intelligence gathering, maneuvering, etc. So the military sees this as a connected chain link of which outer space is a critical component. Unless you believe that Space Command was out, because it did exist. Space Command as a combatant command of the military existed back in the early 2000s or the 90s. My military history is off, but it got resurrected, much like the Undertaker here. It got brought back to life, and there are all sorts of effects that they help to manage. So we're not just talking about destructive effects. I've talked about a lot of different types of use of military force, but we'll kind of briefly go through them. That includes non-kinetic. So we're not talking about destroying something, putting destructive, explosive force on an object. So non-kinetic acts could be something like jamming. So disrupting that signal between the ground station you see there in the blue and the satellite, and either disabling that satellite's ability to do what it's supposed to do, so communicate directions, facilitate communication between troops, etc. It could involve something like spoofing. So this is sort of a cousin to jamming, in which you trick the satellite into believing that the signal it's receiving is from its appropriate ground station. So satellite's just listening for orders as it goes around and does its thing. And you spoof that. You pretend to be that ground station, and you tell it to do things. Maybe you tell that satellite to burn up its fuel reserves and re-enter the atmosphere, or you tell it to maneuver into a disadvantageous position, get out of position so that it can't effectively communicate or facilitate communications. So you're tricking the satellite or the ground station. You could trick the ground station with spoofing as well, make it think that it's talking to the satellite, and in reality that communication is going nowhere. Laser dazzling is another thing. Think of this like blinding the satellite. You're preventing it from seeing or being able to do what it's supposed to do. Oftentimes, this could be a temporary effect that you're putting on that satellite. The United States has a pretty robust and complex Space Command apparatus. Right now, this is split between Huntsville, Alabama, and Colorado. And you see here a pretty complex laydown. All four branches of the military are laid down here. The Army, Navy, Marines, Air Force, Space Force are all represented. Space Command is a 4-star command. We call that a combatant command. So it is sort of the highest level of functional component commands here. So there are only a handful of other 4-star commands in the U.S. military, but you see this spider web of complexity beyond that. That tends to the various capabilities. The Army owns the U.S. military's ground to space-based effects. So there are all sorts of things that we can do from the ground to impact things that are in space. You don't need to put a soldier into orbit to do that, or put an object into orbit to do that. The Army has a lot of capabilities and well-trained soldiers to be able to do that. Although I would point out here, those are Marines here. So we'll allow them to play with our equipment there. I mentioned Viasat. You see their logo there. We have a robust sort of space operations apparatus. I put the Space Operations Center on here because the acronym, calling it Spock, is just, it's right there. It's amazing. I don't know if that was intentional. Some Star Trek fan embedded deep within the Department of Defense, but bravo. I say that as a Star Wars fan. And we also have a lot in terms of early warning capabilities. I mentioned that the business of detection is absolutely critical when it comes to early warning for reacting against missile launches or other activities, movement of troops, etc. It's also really critical to informing our own strategic decisions. Where do we move troops? Where do we need to position folks? What are our adversaries doing? This early warning capability relies extensively on space-based capabilities, and there's no kinetic effects that are based on that, where it's not, that network is not destroying anything, but it's absolutely critical. The breakdown of that early warning system is on full display in that House of Dynamite movie. It's a point that really kind of gets glossed over, but the US doesn't realize or doesn't know who launched that ICBM in the movie. And it's because of some either vulnerability or adversarial effect that was done on our early warning detection capability. So in the movie, the US detects the ICBM, but it's after the point of launch, so we don't know where it came from. Across the movie, they're speculating, could it be China, could it be North Korea, but they don't know for sure. We have elements that are doing all of these things in far-flung places. So the Kwajalein Atoll is one location that the Army has soldiers out doing this sort of work. You see one of those forward radars there, that little dot on the left side, I guess strung across the atoll from the left side down to the center. But that's out in the Pacific, providing early warning capability. You have the Reagan test site that's out there that assists with research and development capabilities. And you see those domes and dishes there that are working around the clock on that early warning, detection, et cetera, capabilities. Fort Greely is relevant, connected to that clip. The soldiers that you saw in that clip, those missile launches, those are ground-based interceptors. Those are being launched out of Fort Greely in Alaska. This sits relatively close to Fairbanks, Alaska. The bright metropolis, the very warm metropolis. It's only really cold like this, like 1 or 2 weeks a year. Maybe some of you have been stationed up there. It's really, I hear it's like Hawaii up in Fort Greely. But this is one of the sites of our ground-based interceptors. So I talked about before, the business of space conflict not always involving just stuff that's in orbit. Fort Greely is a great demonstration of that. We have missile fields out there. Those ground-based interceptors, the GBIs for short, are based. Those are critical components in our missile defense apparatus as it currently is constructed. So the ability to be sort of far west and detect or be positioned to intercept ICBMs that are coming in that direction is absolutely critical for the positioning of this place. Those missile fields, as you saw, those soldiers are out there, with the finger on the trigger, so to speak, monitoring and with the ability to, in short order, launch. This is really critical because when it comes to ICBMs, I mentioned how fast satellites are going, like tens of thousands of kilometers an hour around the Earth. The window to intercept an ICBM is exceptionally narrow. What you're talking about is a narrow point in the mid-course range. So a missile like that will follow an arc generally. Obviously, it's going to be very difficult, if not impossible, to hit the missile right at launch. That's, you would be getting very lucky if you had a window in that short time frame. But you have a few minutes During the mid-course phase, so that point at which it's transiting, it goes orbital on its way to its destination to affect that missile. Once it passes the apogee, so that top point in the arc, it goes what's called terminal. It reaches terminal velocity. It goes even faster. It's re-entered orbit. You heard the strategic command commander, Stratcom commander say, hey, we're tracking this thing is about to go suborbital. That means that missile is going into its terminal phase. Suborbital just means it's re-entering Earth's atmosphere, and it is traveling at a rate that is too fast to intercept. At that point, even before during the mid-course point, you're talking about trying to hit a needle with a needle. So it's a difficult proposition. The military, that movie, it's a movie, it's fictional, so you can say what you will about its accuracy, but I think it reasonably accurately represents the difficult problem set that exists around trying to shoot a missile down that's on its way, and not the least of which is the time component. You just have such a limited range of time before a missile like that goes into its terminal phase. There's just no room for error. You don't have room to get a second or third bite at the apple. You've got a limited set of options at any point, and that's with really advanced technology and whatnot. So that's Fort Greely's relevance in all of this. There's one of the GBIs from its missile field. I also pointed out the military still has astronauts. There's one orbiting. I don't think she's come back yet. I think she's still aboard the ISS. So above you right now is an Army astronaut, Colonel Ann McLean. She's an active duty Army officer, part of our NASA detachment, and she serves in a NASA capacity, so a civilian facing role. And unless I'm wrong, unless she's come back to Earth and I just missed it, she's orbiting above us right now. And frequently the Army has a representative up on missions up there as well.